The Formula One season is about 2 months away, with the unveiling of the cars coming in about a month's time. With that, most of the drivers are going to be wishing for something next year, but what are they going to be wishing for? In this video, we're going to be going across what every driver wishes they had for at least next season. To start off, we're going to go through the reigning champion, the Lion, Max Verstappen. Max has won the last 2 seasons in dominant fashion, and to be fair, I don't think he'll be wishing for much else to continue or to change in that. But what I would think he would be wishing for is a fight for the championship. If you asked him and you had to rank what championships he holds the highest, I think he's even said it in an interview that 2021 was his favorite championship, precisely because it came down to the line. Now, of course, we know there was a lot of controversy with that championship, but no one can argue that that championship didn't have an amazing fight, a fight for the ages. So a bit like Lewis when he was dominating and he was wishing for a fight, I think Max Verstappen is really wishing for a fight for the championship that he can really take down to the wire and show his skills off once again. Next is Sergio Perez. Sergio Perez built a career of not only being reliable, but outperforming his car. In his Force India days, McLaren days, and Racing Point days, he has shown to be the go-to guy when you need a solid performance 100% of the time. But since he's joined Red Bull, his performances has dwindled, every season seemingly getting further and further away from Max, and this season, with the entry of Daniel Ricciardo back into the sport, has had a lot of talk about losing his seat. Finishing the championship standings less than half the points of Max Verstappen, I'm sure this season he's just going to be hoping to stay close to Max, not only so he can keep his seat from people like Daniel Ricciardo or maybe even Yuki Tsunoda, but so that next season he can try and launch an attack in 2025 and try and fight for the title again. Going into the 2023 season, he did say he wanted to fight for the championship, but those hopes quickly dwindled. So I'm sure this season he just wants to get it back into reality and get close to Max so that next season he can reload and fire again. Now we have the 7-time world champion, the possible GOAT, Lewis Hamilton. Now I think this is pretty obvious what Lewis is going to be aiming for, is to win his 8th. Lewis has been hunting down that 8th title for a few years now, and apart from 2021 Abu Dhabi, in which I guess you could say there was some manipulation at play, most of the reason why he hasn't been able to try and get his 8th world title is because Mercedes haven't been able to produce a competitive car. With this season, he hopes that Mercedes are going to give him the car and the edge, with them ditching the no side pods design and seeing a lot more promise from that car from Monaco onwards. Although the car still being inconsistent, it does show a lot of promise. Don't be surprised if you see the W15 look very similar to last season's Red Bull, and Hamilton very happy in trying to replicate the RB19 in order to get closer to Red Bull and win his 8th championship. I think after he wins his 8th championship, Hamilton's place in the sport would have been cemented as the greatest of all time, and he'll be safely comfortable at least to retire from the sport. Him saying that he has 5 more years in him doesn't really feel like he has 5 more years left to race, but 5 more years to get that 8th title, and from there he is just going to be like Kimi Räikkönen, racing as a hobby. Next on the list is the caramel latte man himself, George Russell. George Russell burst into the sport in 2019, giving an amazing performances. Although still at the back of the grid, his potential was there. In 2021, he put his Williams, which was a backmarker car, on the first row of the grid next to Max Verstappen, and although the race didn't take place, he still managed to get a podium from it, showing what a brilliant qualifier he was. Now in his Mercedes era, he hasn't managed to go from strength to strength like he did in Williams. Although he did beat Hamilton in his first season there was some controversies around Hamilton having different setups and more sensors on the car, which made him overall slower. In the second year, in 2023, I think it's fair to say Hamilton comfortably beat him, taking most of the races and going head-to-head in qualifying, with George just about managing to keep it level at the end of the season. I think it's fair to say that if you add the points together and the race performances together, George has been a step behind Lewis. So this season, it has become clear that George is going to want to beat Lewis to try and cement himself as the new protege in the team and the number 1 in the team. I think this comes to George before winning the world title, because all of George's age mates, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Lando Norris, all of them, and Albon, all of them are number ones in their teams respectively, with George having to not necessarily play second fiddle to Lewis, but knowing that Lewis can truly take him in a one-on-one battle. So he is going to want to cement his place as the first driver in the Mercedes-AMG F1 Petronas F1 team and beat Hamilton. The next on the list is Lance Stroll, Lance Strulovich. The man that has been called a pay driver since 2016 or whenever he joined the sport. Stroll has caught a lot of flack over the years for only being in the sport because of his dad, and this year was no different. Fernando Alonso joining the team would make a good comparison to how he did, with him narrowly beating a retiring Vettel last year. And Fernando Alonso, still hungry for a title, would absolutely steamroll Lance Stroll, having to give him props in the media to make it not look as bad as it did. In fact, some of the performances in the early half of the season, which allowed Stroll to get wins over Alonso in the one-on-one battle, happened because Alonso simply refused to overtake him because there was no benefit to it. Nonetheless, in a season where Aston Martin greatly improved their car at the start of the year at least and were capable of getting podiums consecutively, Stroll did not capitalize on this, his best performance being a P4 in Australia. So he's going to want to beat a Fernando Alonso that is older and is closer to retirement than ever. Otherwise, there are going to be serious questions as to whether Lance Stroll should really be in the team. There are already massive questions with the massive points gap last season. However, if he does remain equally behind this season, I think questions are going to be turned into contracts terminated. Just joking, he will never get fired by his dad. Speaking of the Spaniard, he is one to watch this season as well, and he is going to want to get a win. Fernando Alonso came seriously close to getting a win and a pole position last year if he would have pitted 2 laps earlier in Monaco, and if Max hadn't done a monstrous last sector in Monaco's qualifying in 2023, this denying Fernando Alonso a win by the slimmest of margins. But this year, he's going to want to get a win. Fernando Alonso's last win was 11 years ago in 2013. And although he has looked very prime and very ready to get a win, the car just hasn't been there. Good enough to get on the podium, but not good enough to beat Max. So this year, I'm sure he's going to want to end that streak, and probably the longest ever streak between wins, and get a win in Formula One. Now, the last team Alonso had a win with was Ferrari. And speaking of Ferrari, let's talk about their drivers. Charles Leclerc, who is a seriously fast qualifier, however in the race can run into problems. I think this year he's just going to want a competitive car. In 2022, although he did have a competitive car at the start of the season, it quickly tapered off with Red Bull's performance and upgrades too much for Ferrari to handle. That, coupled with the pressure and Leclerc's mistakes and Ferrari's mistakes, meant that the title fight was over just as it begun. So this year, I think above all things, he's going to want to have a competitive car. Obviously, he's going to want to have things like a good strategist, because we all know what Ferrari strategy looks like these days, and a cooperative teammate, but he's going to want to have a competitive car, and I think that's all he's praying for Ferrari. At this point, I think Leclerc's caught on to Ferrari's games, and he knows that they may not be able to give him the best pit stops or the best strategy, but if he has the car beneath him, he does believe in himself to get the result and ultimately secure a championship. So he's going to be hoping for a competitive car. On the other hand, his teammate Carlos Sainz is going to want to be seen as the number one driver. Carlos Sainz has been an outstanding performer ever since he came in the team in 2021, narrowly getting similar points to Charles Leclerc. This season is no different, with him being not so far off Charles Leclerc and being the only driver other than a Red Bull driver to get a win this season. He's going to want to extend that, of course. He's going to want to fight for titles, but above all else, I think he's going to want to be seen as the number one driver in Ferrari. He knows that Ferrari are going to be quick to tell Sainz to play the dog game and to sacrifice his race for Leclerc like they did in Silverstone 2022. But if he can secure that number one driver spot, I think he will believe that he will not only have the backing of his Ferrari team, but he'll be in a much more comfortable position to drive at the best of his ability. Moving on to the next team, it is the Papayas McLaren. Now, Lando Norris, His is, I think, pretty obvious, the most obvious for everyone, and it's to get a win. Although he could have got a win in Russia 2021, thanks to, well, it was his fault that he didn't get the win, but he should have got a win in Russia 2021. Lando Norris has been seeking that infamous win for a few years now. And in fact, his teammate Piastri has come closer to get a win than he has. So I'm sure this year he's going to want to get a win. McLaren's rise midway through the season has shown that they can develop a car that can become seriously competitive. And he's going to want that car to be competitive at the start of the season, and he's going to want to get a win early on. It gets really dicey later on into the season when development starts getting really hectic. So I'm sure that Norris is going to want to get out of the blocks early, have a good test, and win one of the opening few races. And I think the same thing can be said for his teammate Piastri. Piastri has somewhat controversially burst onto the McLaren scene, having originally been signed to Alpine, but the whole controversy of Alonso leaving and the silly season made it so that Piastri actually signed for McLaren in his infamous "I am not a driver for Alpine" message. But in signing with McLaren, he has proven to be an amazing asset, especially for the future, with him getting multiple P2s and with a little bit of bad luck missing out on a couple of podiums as well. So I'm sure he's going to be thinking about not only Norris but a win next season, mainly because he knows what he can do in a competitive car now, and he is feeling a lot more confident in the sport, having the backing of his team. With no contract fears for the foreseeable future, Piastri's future is secure in McLaren, and so he's just focused on getting wins and future titles. Okay, that's it. That's part 1. I'm probably going to do a part 2 of this to cover the remaining 10 drivers, but this is at least the top 10 drivers in the top 5 teams, what they want for the season.